Hi Liz.
Hello Steve.
These are some, first of short videos about the development of cognitive analytic therapy, the ideas and the methods.
Yes.
And this number one, you're one of the first people to get involved in working with Tony Ryle. You're going to say a little bit about how the model began.
I shall attempt that, yes. I'm Liz McCormick. I met Tony Ryle in 1983 when I was working at Guy's, and then I joined what was then called the Brief Therapy Project in January 1984. And one of the huge attractions at the time was that everything was fairly at an experimental stage. So there were a whole group of us from very different backgrounds who met Tony on a Thursday afternoon at the Munro Clinic. He already had developed the psychotherapy file, the traps, dilemmas, snags. Unstable states of mind were to come, because he didn't anticipate taking borderline patients. To begin with, he asked reasonably well neurotic patients to be sent to him, but anyone was referred to him. So the Borderline Project grew out of really those afternoons of experimenting with him and discussing how things should be moved along.
So what were the ideas that he brought?
What he brought were traps, dilemmas, snags, which he would have said were all to do with himself. You know, I think he'd had a Freudian analysis and a Jungian analysis, and that was his reappraisal. He'd also spent a year in the United States when his wife was, I think she'd gone back to teach at the art school in Boston, so he'd also spent a year studying with Mann and Armbeck.
But hadn't the traps, snags and dilemmas grown out of his very strong early research interest in trying to think about outcome in psychoanalytic therapies? What was it that how could one understand change? To understand change, you needed a clear statement with the client at the beginning of their focal problem.
Yes.
And a trap or a snag or a dilemma emerged from him looking at a series
how you could name them in sort of reasonably understandable terms and work with that, yes, and have a focus for the work.
And these ideas came from partly Kelly's
personal construct theory and the repertory grid. In the early days, the repertory grid was very, very important, particularly for research projects.
And one idea was, and it's a lovely example, there are several in history, of where the researcher comes up with something with a research hat on that the clients find more useful than the actual therapy model. And Tony's clients found that his descriptions for research purposes of their target problem and their key patterns were more clear, more in their own language than the perhaps otherwise interpretive languages, psychoanalysis.
So those are the seeds of the reformulation, the prose reformulation in particular, growing in those days. But particularly in the early days we had something we called the rating sheet, and I think there's a debate now on how much the rating sheet's used and how much the diagrammatic reformulation is used. But in the early days we had at the top, you know, the problem, eating disorders, whatever, and then the procedure, the target procedure that underlined that, which was maybe to do with inability to express anger, for example. And then there would be the aim, which would be maybe self-monitoring would be the beginning aim, just noticing every day, monitoring eating, monitoring feeling states, whatever. And then after that it would be stopping and revising.
So this beginning of what we later all understood as the prose reformulation was a short statement of the target problem as the focus of therapy.
Yes.
The target problem, procedure or pattern maintaining that problem.
Yes.
A little bit beginning to think about where did that pattern come from, the history of it. But the first idea then was the procedural sequence, that this maintaining pattern had elements of intention, appraisal, emotion, cognition, behaviour, environmental consequences. It was a kind of very relational understanding.
And made sense of to the patient. It had to make sense of where these patterns had come from and how they were maintained.
And there's a phrase that you mentioned that you say was an early one of Tony's, the symptom hook. Could you say a bit about that?
It is Tony Ryle's expression. And the need, particularly for all therapy, but in a brief therapy, is to get under the symptom hook. that the symptom is just one experience of struggle, of trying to manage in a difficult, disordered emotional world.
So say
And-
drinking is a symptom, or
Yes,
depression is a symptom.
Yes, yes.
But underneath it,
Underneath
is
that, it's
something-
the story, as if all my life I've had to be very, very good, because if I wasn't very good, I'd be seen as very, very bad, which was very, very frightening. So in order to cope with the pressure of that, I've learned striving, and that's led me to become exhausted, or, you know, this.
And the document which we now use routinely, the psychotherapy file, in those early days, described a number of procedures, typical procedures,
Yes.
almost like, I think Tony Ryle uses the phrase model procedures. They're never quite the words of the client,
Yes,
but they help the client and the therapist get into describing these underlying patterns and getting off the symptom hook
yes.
and into, I don't know whether this would fit with the early days, almost the idea of doing two therapies at once. One is more trying to problem solve, but the other is this idea of some loosening or freeing of a sense of self, that I have a stronger, more open sense of myself because I can see how these patterns
Yes,
shape
yes, yes.
who I am.
You've reminded me, Steve, of a story Tony probably still tells, but what I remember was that when he and Flora knew they were going to Boston for the year, he had to finish the therapy he was doing, and they had 4 months, the 16 sessions, and he was working long term with people. And so what he did was he went through their files and looked at all their notes, and then he was beginning this whole thing of reappraising. He gave them the notice, the 4 months. But what he also said was, a novel idea in therapy is to say, why don't you stop? This is your pattern, why don't you stop? What would happen if you stopped? And that was quite revolutionary. And in those 4 months, quite a lot of those people, symptoms improved hugely.
So naming the pattern, what we might equally say naming the dance, and seeing how
yes.
it takes two to tango.
What maintains it?
What maintains it, how second nature has become. It's become so
Yes.
familiar to me, I can't
Yes.
see it until I
Yes.
can begin to write it out and describe it and talk about it.
And
What
then we
do-
unpick it really slowly. I mean, that's part of the middle phase of the therapy.
So I sense we're touching on things that we might talk about
about
in
in
another
another- yes,
video,
yes.
and particularly the idea of reciprocal role procedures,
Yes,
which is
yes.
the more developed idea that arose in those early days. We might talk about reformulation
Yes.
in the second video. But is there any more you want to say about this atmosphere that Tony Ryle created? It was a group of you.
It was a
wasn't
group of us with very different backgrounds. Norma Maple, who sadly died last year, her background was in social work. Anna Lee Curran had been working as counsellor in general practice and with the National Childbirth Trust. My background was in transpersonal psychology and social psychiatry. And then there were a number of, Shakir Ansari was a consultant psychiatrist, a number of psychologists, B. Brockman was psychiatrist, Pauline Carmedo was psychiatrist. Lots of people were really interested in doing something collaborative, sharing, and also it was at a time when to train as a psychotherapist was a very long process. And Tony's idea was that it should be possible to train professionals who already had a qualification in working in mental health to do this particular kind of therapy, which he's right, isn't he? 30 years on, that there are people from all different backgrounds learning CAT.
So the influences were, one, he'd worked during the 50s as a GP.
He's worked as a GP.
Hackney.
Yes.
And had realised that many of the patient calls on his practice were psychologically driven.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in Guy's
Students.
and St.
He'd been
Student
at Sussex University as a student health.
that many of the problems were psychologically driven, and in psychiatry and in Guy's and St. Thomas's, the existing arrangements for psychological therapy were so cumbersome and
Yes.
psychoanalytically
Yes.
driven that they couldn't possibly meet the need.
Absolutely right.
And on the
yes.
principle of equality or fairness to all, something quicker, shorter and more collaborative
Yes.
was needed,
Yes. More humane too.
and that more people could do. I have one other thought about the early days, that I've always wondered if the model is not so much a model for the client as a model for the therapist, that it helps the therapist get organised and
Yes.
get focused.
Yes. 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 And of course, it's quite hard work, isn't it, doing CAT, compared to some of the open-ended therapies where there's a lot of silence. And the old days when, you know, in the Freudian therapy, the analyst would be at the head and there'd be no eye contact. I mean, we know now from neuroscience how important eye contact is. So a CAT therapy, very structured, with very definitive, you know, up to the 4 sessions of reformulation, the middle phase, then the ending phase, with the ending on the agenda right from the beginning, was tremendously useful structure for the therapist. They also had to think about it in between, and that's something Tony felt very strongly about.
So it's nearly 35 years since
Is
those
it?
early days. Just to finish, is there anything more to be said about the atmosphere then?
Well, of course, I think about them slightly nostalgically and with great affection. I feel very lucky that I met Tony Rowell when I did. And how amazing it's been to see CAT blossom and open up and flourish, and the ideas, you know, that you've brought in with the mapping and the dialogic sequence, the work of Bakhtin that came through Michael Lehman a little bit later on, and now mindfulness is coming in, because that's something else we're going to talk about.
You've contributed.
Mindfulness and
So these are all
dialogic.
topics, all topics that we perhaps particularly need to devote one, perhaps our next one, to the joint discoveries
Yes.
that between them Tony Ryle and Michael Lehman
Yes,
brought, to
that would be
really
good.
taking the model
Yes.
from a particular way of thinking cognitively about psychoanalytic object relations to a
Yes.
much bigger, richer
Yes.
framework, combining Vygotsky and...
Yes. It also says something about the openness of Tony Rowell, doesn't it? That he was open to other people coming in with their ideas and the way they could be integrated into the model. I think that's a natural part of his generosity, but I think it makes the model very, very accessible, and it's the scaffolding he set, as we set it in the early days, that holds.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.